Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Well, welcome to the Society of Professional Economists annual conference. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to Bloomberg. Once again, we're able to put this conference on free to members thanks to the generosity of Bloomberg, and it's great that we're back in this splendid auditorium. I see it's absolutely packed. Also, fantastic news is that Stephanie Flanders, Bloomberg's head of economics, has once again agreed to be our compere for this afternoon. Thank you, Stephanie. I can't think of anyone better to ask the searching questions of our speakers today. I also want to thank those members of the SPE Council who provided input into organising today's conference, and also to Katie Abberton and Sam Isdell Carpenter from the SPE admin team for all their help in putting today's event together. It's proving to be quite a busy November for SPE events. Following this afternoon's conference, we've got our annual dinner on Monday with Banque de France Governor Francois Villeroy de Galhau. He's our guest speaker. The following week we have Sam Beckett from the UK Treasury, who'll be walking us through the detail of the autumn statement. And also on the same day we've got our AGM. The week after that we're hosting a breakfast event on the state of the UK housing market. If you're not signed up to any or all of those, then please do see Sam and Katie at the end, or go to spe.org.uk or see me and we can sign you up. You'll be pleased to know that we're working hard as well to put together a great lineup of speaker events in 2024. Kicks off as always with our look ahead in January to what's in store for the UK economy for the rest of the year. But before all of that, we've got today's conference. The theme of the conference this year is future-proofing the global economy. And I think that when you have some conferences, they have titles that are not always a true reflection of some of the individual sessions within that. But in the case of today's conference, I think all of the sessions really do speak to that theme of looking forward to the future. We've got sessions on climate change, on the influence of technology on the global economy, how we can become better forecasters, and the outlook for UK monetary policy and also politics at what is a particularly interesting juncture for both. Just one more word of thanks, and that's to our SPE president, Sir Dave Ramsden, who is not only on the hook for the first speech this afternoon, but will also be saying a few words at our dinner on Monday. And all of that after having given a speech yesterday at the ESRB. But of course, there is not such a thing as too much Dave Ramsden, so we are very happy to have you here. Thank you for making the space in your very busy schedule for this. We're eternally grateful for all your support to the Society and very much look forward to hearing your thoughts. So without further ado and without wanting to steal too much of our host's thunder, let me now hand the floor over to Stephanie.
Well, actually, George also didn't mention that, although it is obviously great news that I'm hosting, but it's good news for you and me that I'm doing quite a lot less work than last year. Those of you who are here know that I was put to work on quite a lot of the sessions, and I think everyone is better off without it. But you will see me popping up and down. The way that it reminds me that when George is talking about this busy weekend that the SPE has, it's sort of, I think you should have been sort of offering it as a sort of London city break. You have your afternoon of very high level economics and you can kind of hang out in London and then get an extra fill with the governor of the Bank of France on Monday. I think next time you've missed a trick on that. I think when we think about, I'm not going to give a long speech about the economy, God help us, but I think it is kind of interesting. If I think back to last year, I think most of us, certainly knowing what was happening with monetary policy and predicting what was to come in terms of the tightening of policy, increase in yields has, I think, exceeded many people's expectations, not our US chief economist, but almost everyone. If you'd known all of that, you would not necessarily have thought that the US economy, the Eurozone economy, and I think even the UK economy would be quite where they are today, and certainly where the unemployment rate is today. So I think this is an interesting time where we can actually say, yes, a lot has happened in the last year economically, but potentially we may be able to start sort of questioning some of those, what we thought we knew about what it takes to bring down inflation, if the forecasts for the next couple of years turn out to be even roughly right. But maybe next year we'll be discussing why the inflation forecasts were completely wrong. But I do think that's kind of one of the questions that's hanging over some of the sessions this afternoon. Does this path that we think we're on actually make sense? Can we understand why unemployment has not risen as much as we might have expected, and all of those things? And I'm glad that we're kind of getting into some of those core economic issues. But we also have, as you look down the programme, whether it's environment, productivity, I think we're getting into some of the sort of really compelling long-term issues that we all need to have an answer to, and probably don't feel like we do. As a little quick plug for Bloomberg Economics, I think in the last year, certainly since I've arrived, we've expanded the team of economists for Bloomberg Economics. When I arrived, it was about 27 economists. By the end of this year, we'll have closer to 50. And the particular areas that we've expanded over the last year, which is relevant to some of this afternoon, is we've created a geoeconomics team, which has also instantly been very busy thinking about Ukraine, Taiwan. We have the person who was advising the president of the National Security Council on Taiwan is now advising us and Bloomberg clients. And the other team that we've created over the last couple of years, which many of you will be familiar with, and I think Bjorn van Roy was here last time, is the GMAT team that creates very state-of-the-art econometric tools and models, including nowcasting and yield forecast for the terminal. And you're going to get a bit of a sense of that from Anna Galvao, who we had tempted from Warwick earlier this year. Or no, you might have even been here for longer than that. But that's it in terms of the promotional material. I'm delighted that we do have Sir Dave Ramsden to kick us off on the core monetary policy territory. As he was just reminding me, the Bank of England, at least, has future-proofed itself by giving him another term, going through for at least another 5 years, another 4 years from now. He was obviously head of the Government Economic Service before he went to the Bank of England to be Deputy Governor for Markets and Banking in 2017. I will, I don't know, I think I'll sit in the audience, but then come up, maybe ask him a question or two at the end. But I know with this audience, there'll be plenty from you as well. So Dave, thanks very much.
Oh, already. Thanks a lot, Stephanie, and thanks, George, for that introduction and your remark about there being no such thing as too much Dave Ramsden. I mean, I hope you'll feel that in terms of the content of what I'm going to say over the next 30 minutes or so. You might be able to hear I've got quite a heavy cold, so hopefully I'll be able to keep going. Anyway, let me at least start, and it is very nice to be invited to speak here again today, and it does give me a chance to continue my support for the Society of Professional Economists beyond my very limited official duties for the Society, and also thanks to Bloomberg for their support for the SPE through hosting today's conference on future-proofing the world economy. In going back to the future, I'm going to review UK economic developments over the last 12 months compared with the forecasts the MPC's produced over that period. I'll then set out how my thinking on the role played by the forecasts has evolved in the context of the latest November NPR forecast published a fortnight ago. And I'll finish with some personal reflections on the implications of the outlook for monetary policy and why the best thing the MPC can contribute to future-proofing the UK economy is to get inflation back to the 2% target sustainably in the medium term. Now, this speech is a sequel of sorts to one I gave a year ago. Then my focus was on the uncertainty created by the major shocks the UK economy had experienced. Uncertainty remains heightened both from the ongoing consequences of those earlier shocks, including what they imply about the future balance of demand and supply in the economy and the persistence of inflationary pressures. The last year's also seen its fair share of shocks, for example, stresses in the banking system. But while these have impacted on parts of the financial system, their wider macro implications have so far been limited. These more recent shocks could still have more significant implications. But as of now, I feel more confident than I did a year ago about looking beyond the next few months to the economic and policy outlook further out. And to frame my comments on economic developments, Table 1 compares the forecasts from the November 2022 and November 2023 MPRs. The shaded columns are the most recent forecasts, and those in brackets are from a year ago. And the table brings out 5 of the key features of UK economic developments over the last year. First, the double-digit peak and subsequent sharp fallback in headline CPI inflation, which has been broadly in line with our November 2022 forecast. Second, the divergent trends in the contributions of the main components of inflation, in particular the much greater negative contribution from energy, which has been largely offset by a much greater positive contribution of services inflation, a major indication of potential inflationary persistence. Third, the greater resilience and expected inactivity, closely linked to the sharp easing in energy price pressures, but also the tightness of the labour market, the fourth key feature. And this in turn has supported higher than expected wage growth, the fifth main feature, and I'll come back to say something about market expectations for bank rate later. So in contrast with 2021 and 2022, Chart 1 shows developments in headline CPI inflation have followed the track of our short-term forecasts more closely over the last year. Inflation peaked at 11.1% in October 2022, but remained above 10% until April, reflecting the cumulative impact of the 2 unprecedented global shocks, the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, working through to consumer prices. Since April 2023, inflation has fallen back sharply as household energy bills in particular have come down. The resetting of the price cap in October drove a further sharp fall in inflation in headline CPI to 4.6% as published this week, slightly below our latest forecast, both for the month and for 2023 Q4 as a whole. Now, the encouraging progress on headline inflation marks diverging and significant trends in the components of CPI, as the different shadings in the left-hand and right-hand panels of Chart 2 show. The left-hand is the projection from a year ago, and the right-hand is the projection from a fortnight ago. Falling energy prices, and electricity and gas on the chart, have been the key driver contributing to the fall in inflation, and have fallen much faster than expected a year ago. The peak to trough in the orange bars in the right-hand panel shows they will have contributed well over 4 percentage points to the expected 6 percentage point decline in inflation in the year to 2023 Q4, despite only accounting for a small share, around a 20th of the CPI basket. Core goods inflation and food inflation, which are directly and indirectly impacted by energy prices, have also started to ease materially, albeit with a lag to the fall in energy prices. But of course, while the inflation rates in energy and to a lesser extent food prices have fallen back from their peaks, the level of both remains high, which means the cost of living challenges faced by many households, particularly those on lower household incomes, continue. Now, rather than starting to fall back as we'd forecast last November, services inflation continued to rise through the first half of 2023. Peaking at 7.4% in July. It's since fallen to 6.6%, still marginally above its average level of 6.5% a year ago. Services CPI outturns have come in slightly lower than we expected in our last 2 forecasts, but are likely to remain elevated in the coming months, driven by labour costs. As a result, services inflation is by far the largest contributor to current inflation, as shown by the yellow bars in the right-hand panel of the chart. And the MPC has been highlighting services inflation as a key indicator of the persistence of inflationary pressures in our communications throughout 2023. Now, just reverting back to Table 1, the first and fourth lines bring out that demand growth has proved much more resilient during 2023 than we'd forecast a year ago. At the end of 2022 and in the first half of 2023, quarterly GDP growth remained positive. The moderation in household energy prices was the key factor here, although growth remained more resilient than implied by the fall in energy prices. GDP growth has since slowed to zero in the latest quarter, and the slowdown in activity has been broadly based across expenditure components and is increasingly evident in consumption, consistent with the recent weakness in indicators of consumer confidence and retail sales, and is linked to the more general weakness of the housing market. So rather than the significant degree of excess supply or slack in the economy, which the MPC forecast a year ago, and that's in the fourth line of the table, the MPC now judges that the UK has experienced excess demand, although to a diminishing degree through 2023, as monetary policy has had an increasing impact. This does not just reflect the relative resilience of demand, but also the MPC's assessment that supply is relatively weak. And an additional underpinning for the resilience of demand and also the increased persistence in inflation has been the tightness of the labour market. With the increasing uncertainty surrounding the ONS LFS data, it's worth noting that the MPC continues to consider a wide range of data to inform our view on developments in labour market activity. Nothing has changed in that regard. Notwithstanding these uncertainties, my assessment is that employment growth has been robust until recently, and unemployment, although picking up somewhat, has not risen by as much as might have been expected, even allowing for the relative strength of demand. With little growth in activity, employment growth is likely to soften over the second half of 2023, but the MPC's latest forecast is for a much more modest rise in unemployment to 4.3% by 23 Q4, compared to the rise to 4.9% forecast a year ago. And although the number of vacancies has continued to ease and unemployment has picked up since the end of 2022, the VU ratio is still higher than it was pre-COVID. Falling vacancies, surveys indicating an easing of recruitment difficulties, and the information we're receiving from the contacts of the bank agents all suggest some loosening in the labour market, though it's clear from my agency visits that persistent skill shortages remain in some sectors. Now, while we don't have alternative data sources on participation to the LFS, I remain confident that changes in participation since 2019 continue to contribute to the tightness in the UK labour market. The strength in the labour market and resilience of economic activity have in turn supported strong pay growth, significantly stronger than forecast, and second round effects have contributed to inflation persistence, particularly in the more labour-intensive services sector. Total average weekly earnings, AWE growth, including the public sector, is forecast to be 6.75% in 23 Q4, higher than a year ago and compared to a forecast of 4.25% in the November 22 NPR forecast, which was driven by a much more significant expected loosening in the labour market. Now, the annual rate of growth of AWE private sector regular pay, which should give a better indication of underlying labour market pressures, remained high at 7.8% in the most recent quarter, slightly lower than its peak of 8.2% in the second quarter, but still above the rate of 7.3% in 22 Q4. Now, while pay growth has remained high across a range of indicators at around 7%, the further acceleration of AWE growth earlier in the year is not apparent in other survey-based series. Now, having looked backwards, let me now turn to the future. The MPC set out its updated best collective judgment on the outlook for the next 3 years in the November NPR a fortnight ago. And overall, my expectations for the outlook for the UK economy and the risks around it are in line with the forecast presented. This is truer now for me than has been the case with recent NPR forecasts, with the November 2022 NPR probably marking the low point in my degree of commitment to its role as a best collective judgment. I want to briefly set out the reasons why this is the case, but I won't have time, except in passing, to develop my thinking on how we make use of the forecast. You'll be hearing much more on the subject from Charlie Bean later this afternoon, who I'm sure will have plenty of insights. And we all look forward to seeing what Ben Bernanke concludes when he completes his review of the MPC's approach to forecasting next spring. Now, focusing first on the short-term outlook for the months ahead, I see our forecast as being well aligned with the recent main trends in the economy. On activity, there are increasing signs that higher interest rates are weighing on demand, resulting in quarterly GDP growth around zero, and with weaker demand leading to further easing in labour market tightness, with unemployment continuing to pick up. Chart 3 focuses in on the right-hand panel of the previous chart to show the path of and contributions to our latest short-term forecast of inflation. While we can be confident about the contribution from household energy bills to lower inflation over the coming months, there are upside risks to short-term inflation from the tragic events in the Middle East. There are uncertainties about the time it will take other non-energy components of inflation to come down, but I see the short-term risks here as broadly balanced, particularly given the latest falls in services and core goods inflation. In the absence of further shocks, the MPR forecast for CPI inflation to fall below 4% as soon as March 2024 looks achievable. Although there remain uncertainties about the near-term path of pay, some indicators do suggest that wage growth will start to moderate. Chart 4 shows that wage growth is projected to decline in the coming months, reflecting the falls in headline inflation and the lower short-term expectations which result, as well as further easing in labour market tightness. Now, a short-term outlook which is broadly characterised by recent trends continuing is consistent with there having been fewer shocks over the last few months. And this more benign environment for forecasting has contributed to the errors on the bank's largely mechanical short-term forecasting models for GDP, unemployment, earnings and inflation becoming more two-sided, although there remain differences in their relative performance. Looking beyond spring 2024, I'm much more comfortable, notwithstanding the current uncertainties, with the profiles and contours of our latest forecasts. This is quite a big change from my position a year ago, when the high level of uncertainty and rapidly changing outlook led me to describe our central forecast as more like a baseline scenario. And as a result, I was focusing on the performance of the very short-term forecasts to guide my monetary policy thinking. The evolution in my position reflects various factors: the improved performance of bank staff's short-term forecasts, a more well-founded set of conditioning assumptions, which I'll come back to, the balance of judgments the MPC has made in successive forecasting rounds, and the overall story about the economy that the forecast embodies. To recap, in our latest forecast, GDP growth is projected to continue to flatline through to the end of 2024 as restrictive monetary policy continues to weigh significantly on demand. Based on the average relationships over the past between bank rate, other financial instruments and economic activity, bank staff estimate that more than half of the domestic impact of higher interest rates on the level of GDP is still to come through, with the peak impact on GDP growth around the current quarter, although there is significant uncertainty around these estimates. Growth then picks up gradually through 2025 and 2026, but remains weak by historical standards. Let me just go back so you can see that table. Economics rising to only 1% by the end of the forecast period. Economic slack opens up, with unemployment rising steadily but not sharply. In the modal or most likely projection, inflation falls to 3.1% by the end of 2024 and returns to close to the 2% target by 2025 Q4. Perhaps the most striking feature of the forecast from a monetary policy perspective is that with subdued growth, it takes another 2 years for inflation to return to target. This in turn reflects several significant judgments we've made in recent forecast rounds, all of which push up on inflation. For the avoidance of doubt, I do want to highlight that every economic forecast I've ever been involved in the course of a long career has involved some judgment. That said, the range and overall weight of judgments in recent MPC forecasts is significant and reflects the very unusual, shock-heavy recent economic history of the UK. Turning to the specifics of our judgments, on the demand side, let me just go back. On the demand side, we've built greater resilience in demand than our forecasting models would suggest, though slightly less in November 2023 than we incorporated in the August 23 MPR. Second, for a given negative impact on activity, we've assumed less of an upwards movement in unemployment than we've seen historically, translates into a smaller Ocon coefficient with knock-on effects on inflation. Finally, given developments in wages over the last year, we've assumed more persistence in wage setting than the determinants of wages in our various models would point to. This in turn could stem from various labour market factors, which have led us to revise up our estimate of the medium-term equilibrium unemployment rate to 4.5%. The chart here shows that this judgment pushes wage growth over 1% above the top of the swathe produced by our three main models. As the degree of uncertainty has increased in recent years, the MPC collectively and individually have put more and more weight on scenarios and thinking about and communicating our positions. This year, alongside modelling various alternative futures, our forecast rounds have been informed by a range of cross-checks to the forecast. On balance, these point to more inflationary persistence. One such model is based on Bernanke and Blanchard's work, which explains inflationary post-pandemic trends in the US. Analysis undertaken by bank staff replicating these results for the UK economy predicted a higher inflation profile compared to the MPC forecast, driven by greater inflation persistence. Similarly, a VAR model, a purely statistical cross-check to the MPC forecast, also points to potential upside risks around the inflation outlook. By contrast, the more structural model of the UK economy with search and matching frictions suggests potential downside risks to the MPC's inflation forecast due to a weakening of real economic activity and a reduction in energy prices. Taken with all the other evidence, these cross-checks have informed my assessment, consistent with the rest of the MPC, that even after allowing for the cumulative effect of our forecast judgments, risks to the forecast inflation path remain to the upside. And we've allowed for this by building in a skew to the forecast, which leaves the mean or expected inflation rate just above the 2% target in 2025 Q4, 2 years from now. The story of our November MPR forecast, subdued growth and stubbornly high inflation, implies a challenging path for the economy. Demand growth is subdued by restrictive monetary conditions, but supply is likewise subdued, reflecting the shocks the UK has had to deal with and what we've learnt about their impact. The judgments we've incorporated in recent forecast rounds leave estimated supply growth weaker still than at the time of the February 2023 supply stocktake, when they averaged around 1% over the forecast period, already a very low rate by historical standards. As I've stressed, I think the main conditioning assumptions for the November MPR projections on energy prices, fiscal and financial market pricing provide a sounder foundation for forecasting. There is certainly much less uncertainty about energy prices and fiscal policy than there was last autumn, but I do want to comment on the evolution of the market curve. I do so with an appropriate degree of trepidation. After all, at the time of the November 2022 decision, the MPC took the unusual collective step of communicating that we thought the assumption for bank rate on which the forecasts were conditioned, which showed bank rate peaking at 5.25%, was too high. But that is the level that bank rate has been at since the August 2023 meeting. A year ago, our medium-term forecasts for growth and inflation were well below most outside forecasts, reflecting our conditioning assumptions that energy prices would stay high and our relatively downbeat assessment of the impact on growth in the labour market of those higher energy prices. The key development over the last year, not just in the UK but more generally, has been that much greater persistence of inflation. And at the time that the assumptions for the November MPR were finalised, markets had internalised that message, communicated by central banks, that policy rates were going to have to stay higher for longer relative to previous expectations. Each forecast round, we also published projections based on a conditioning assumption of a constant rate at the prevailing bank rate. And at the time of the November 2023 MPR forecast, this assumption gave projections which were similar to the market curve-based main projections. Now, since the November 2023 forecast was finalised, the market curve has come down, with average rates in swap markets over the 3 years of the forecast falling by around 50 basis points. Bond rates further out on the curve have also fallen by a similar amount. Now, markets, as always, are entitled to make their assessment of the future. But were other things equal, the move in the market curve would mean that financial conditions were less restrictive. Market expectations may be underpinned by a different view about prospects. In their latest projections, independent forecasters expect growth to be stronger than the MPC's modal projection and unemployment to be slightly lower over the medium term. Inflation also falls more quickly towards the 2% target and then stays there. And this pattern of differences would be consistent with outside forecasters being more positive about the outlook for supply and therefore for the output inflation trade-off than the MPC. Now, I'll finish by setting out what these developments in the economy and our approach to forecasting have meant for policy. Bank rates being increased by a total of 2.25 percentage points from 3% at the time of the November 2022 meeting to 5.25% now. And in terms of the MPC's monetary policy decisions and how they've been communicated, I think three phases can be distinguished. In the first phase, in the December 2022 MPS, a majority on the MPC continued to use language that I described in my speech a year ago as indicating our monetary policy reaction function-based approach to economic developments. We did this by stressing that were the economy to evolve broadly in line with the November 2022 MPR projections, then further increases in bank rate were likely to be needed, and that if the outlook suggested more persistent inflationary pressures, the MPC would act forcefully. In light of the evidence of greater persistence, bank rate was increased by 50 basis points at the December 22 meeting. Then at the 4 meetings between February and June this year, our language continued to signal our reaction function, but became more specific. Each MPS over this period highlighted that the MPC would continue to monitor closely indications of persistent inflationary pressures, including the tightness of labour market conditions and the behaviour of wage growth and services inflation. If there were to be evidence of more persistent pressures, then further tightening in monetary policy would be required. And over the 4 meetings, bank rate was increased by a total of 1.5 percentage points, with 50 basis point increases at the February and June meetings and 25 basis point increases at the March and May meetings. The 50 basis point increase in June was particularly noteworthy as it followed a deterioration relative to short-term expectations in all of the 3 groups of indicators, most clearly in the case of CPI services inflation. At the August, September and November 2023 meetings, the MPC retained this reaction function language, but augmented it by highlighting that the current policy stance is restrictive. So this is the third phase. There are different ways of thinking about restrictiveness, but for me, the most straightforward explanation is through the impact policy is having by holding demand in the economy lower than it would otherwise be relative to supply. The committee noted that monetary policy will need to be sufficiently restrictive for sufficiently long to return inflation to the 2% target sustainably in the medium term. Now, for the majority on the MPC, developments in the indicators of persistence over this period warranted a 25 basis point increase in bank rate at the August meeting and no change at the September and November meetings. Throughout this period, the MPC has continued with its programme of quantitative tightening, underpinned by the 3 key principles first set out in August 2021. I covered QT in detail in a speech in July this year, so I won't cover it today. In terms of my latest monetary policy decision, I voted along with 5 other MPC members to maintain bank rate at 5.25% at the November meeting. I continue to characterise my approach to monetary policy as being watchful and responsive. I'll continue to monitor closely the indications of persistent inflationary pressures and resilience in the economy as a whole. And on the basis of our latest projections, a restrictive policy stance is likely to be warranted for an extended period of time to bring inflation sustainably back to the 2% target. Now, given the ongoing risks and uncertainties, it's more important than ever that monetary policy makers remain humble. As I hope I've set out today, I've learned a lot over the last year, which has informed my approach to setting policy. Now, given my assessment of the outlook and the risks, I would not rule out having to respond to evidence of more persistent inflationary pressures by raising bank rate further in the future. but I'll continue to make my decisions meeting to meeting, conditional on my assessment on developments in the economy and what they indicate about prospects for inflation. One aspect of my approach to monetary policy which has changed is that I see less need than I did to follow a robust control approach to monetary policy setting. As the degree of uncertainty has eased somewhat and policies become increasingly restrictive, I'm less concerned than I was about medium-term inflation expectations becoming de-anchored. For example, household inflation expectations in the Citi YouGov survey 5 to 10 years ahead are now around their average levels, and the latest DMP survey for business inflation expectations 3 years ahead edged down further to 3.1% in October compared to 4% a year earlier. In the DMP survey, expectations have also become less skewed to the right over 2023, particularly over the second half of the year. However, market measures of medium-term inflation expectations, such as our preferred measure, the UK adjusted 5-year swap 5 years ahead, shown in chart 7, continue to give me pause for thought, as it remains elevated, although lower than its peak in March 2022. And evidence of an upside skew to market-based medium-term inflation expectations from the bank's MAPS survey of market participants has remained somewhat persistent over 2023. Reflecting back on the year, I would describe myself as having gone, in Tolstoy's often used comparison, from being more of a hedgehog to more of a fox. To the best of my knowledge, this comparison was first used in this context by the late and much missed Alan Budd, who passed away in January, in a lecture he gave as a founding member of the MPC in 1998. From my perspective, having had an increasingly narrow focus on a few indicators over a short time frame, I'm now looking at a broader range of evidence of persistence over the longer time frame of the whole span of our forecast. To conclude, a lot has happened over the last year. Headline CPI inflation has more than halved and stands at 4.6%. But services inflation remains very high at 6.6%, which indicates more persistence in inflationary pressures. My approach to our forecast continues to evolve, as does the MPC's. Developments and a wide range of analysis over the last year have provided the evidence of greater persistence to inflation, together with continued upside risks, and we've set policy accordingly. What hasn't changed is that the role the forecast plays in the setting of monetary policy is conditional, data and projections dependent. This is clear in our communications. Our latest projections indicate that monetary policy is likely to need to be restrictive for an extended period of time to bring inflation back to the 2% target. The MPC's focus remains resolute on getting inflation back to target sustainably in the medium term. Going further back in history reminds us of just how difficult it can be to achieve low and stable inflation. In the 35 years before the MPC was given operational independence for monetary policy, from 1962 to 1997, inflation averaged 6.8%, and in only 1 year, 1994, was it below 2%. In the 25 years from May 97 to April 22, inflation averaged 2%. Returning to the title of today's conference, the most important contribution the MPC can make to future-proofing the UK economy is to get inflation sustainably back to the 2% target. And I will stop there.
Well, Dave, you have wisely left just a few minutes for questions, but I know there'll probably be several from this room. I had I'm going to go to the thing. I had one question, which is not really the predictable journalistic question, but you focused quite a lot on inflation, but you also talk about now having a broader range of things that you're looking at with the comparison of the hedgehog and the fox. I mean, one big thing that we usually look at is the labour market, and one big thing that we use to understand what's going on in the labour market is the Labour Force Survey, which we currently don't have. I just wonder how concerned are you about the quality issues that obviously have been long-standing but have got worse, and the sort of question marks about whether or not we're really going to have a handle on the labour market over the next year or so at this pretty crucial time?
It's I mean, it's obviously a topical question, and having been a student of the UK labour market throughout my professional career,
you're a good person to ask.
I'm a good person to ask. The LFS is important in terms of assessing activity, but as I tried to emphasise, I mean, there are quite a lot of other, particularly on the kind of employment side. We've got the REC survey. We've also got other surveys. So on the kind of quantity side, it does make it more challenging. But the ONS have put out their experimental numbers. They've announced a fortnight ago what they're doing to rectify the situation in terms of response rates. For me, any one piece of data or one survey that you look at, you have to look in the context of everything else. So obviously the LFS is the official series, and it goes through all the auditing and stuff from UKSA. But there's a lot of other information out there that we can also look at. Plus, we've got our agents network. And then on the prices side, it's where, sorry, on the nominal side, the wages side. Sorry, it's my cold cutting in. That's going to be my excuse on all questions. That is a different survey. So, the AW is based on a different survey. That survey had its own issues a few, as I recall, some decades ago, and there was a review to improve that data. So what I tried to do in my speech is to put things in the broader context. And I would say, the labour market is critical at the moment, not just here, but in the US, in the Euro area. But it's not just about the labour market. We're also very focused on understanding what's going on more generally in pricing, the extent to which margins are being rebuilt, as we try and really understand the drivers of this more persistence of inflation.
No, the first hand up was actually at the back there. If you just wait for the mic and just say briefly where you're from.
On AWE, wage inflation. Essentially, in the September minutes, it looks like before that, as you pointed out, there was always this language about persistence in price and wages, and you may tighten more. But that language seems to have changed in September a little bit. So does that mean does the MPC now put less weight on AWE wage inflation? Because clearly that's still very persistent, still very high. You said service inflation still matters a lot. So I guess I'm wondering why the MPC's assessment of AWE has changed, if indeed it has changed.
Yeah, the growth rates in the AWE picked up in the early summer, up. It peaked at just over 8%. And you didn't see that in any of the other surveys of wages that we have. I mean, you have to distinguish, the REC survey is for new employees, so that's not so much the stock as the flow. But all the other indicators that we were looking at of wage pressure look more consistent with wage pressure having topped out at 7% rather than that extra wage growth having topped out at around 7 rather than that extra leg up that was in the AWE. So in terms of, it's probably fair to say that I and other members of the MPC, to differing degrees, have distanced ourselves a bit from that extra leg up. What's clear, though, is that at 7%, and you've seen in the most recent AWE that it's come back down a bit. I think private sector regular wages back down at 7.6%. But, I mean, that's still 7-something, and the other surveys point, and so, that's very high levels of wage growth, which isn't consistent with the 2% inflation target.
Yeah, and then we'll go there. Yeah, if you just wait for
the lights.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Ian Mulhern, Resolution Foundation. David, we've got the autumn statement coming up next week, and obviously for the public finances and a lot else besides, what really matters is what's going to happen in the medium term. And for that, there's a yawning gulf between what the OBR says is potential supply growth and what the bank is indicating now. I think it's about a percentage point. And I just wonder how you'd sort of explain the difference of view and what it is you're seeing that's driving that view. And also to the extent that it is about the labour market and participation, going back to Stephanie's point about the questions over the data, how confident are you that the labour market is the explanation?
I'll leave you to kind of bring out the Resolution Foundation to bring out the differences between the OBR and us when you do all your very comprehensive work that you'll do after Wednesday. I mean, we set out back in February, we do an annual supply stock take, and we set out what were the drivers for us of I think at that point we had an average of supply growth, potential growth, however you describe it, of 1% over the forecast horizon. And the judgments we've made since, if anything, have brought it down a little bit further. When you look at what's driving supply, I mean, this is based on the experimental series that they've produced, but the ONS think that productivity in the year to Q3 was -0.1. I'll come back to saying something about the US in a second because I think it's a relevant comparison. But, that's really weak productivity growth. And looking at, yes, the LFS is the basis for a lot of the assessment of what's happened to participation since before the pandemic, but it's not the only thing you can look at. There's other supporting evidence that, as I said in my speech, I still believe that there is a participation puzzle out there. And then as we flagged more back in February, but we'll return to this because we'll do another supply stock take and publish that next February. When you look at the degree of business investment and capital formation, there's not been, the level of capital deepening, really going back to 2016 or so, has been pretty weak in the UK economy. So those are your main ingredients for potential growth. We'll see what the OBR say when they publish theirs. But as I was saying, I'm comfortable. I mean, it's a challenging picture, but I'm from the perspective of my assessment of the economy, and then I guess how I turn that into monetary policy settings. I think that weakness of supply is a real feature of the UK. Just to give you a comparator, when you look at the US economy at the moment, US GDP growth in the year to Q3 was 2.9%. Ours was 0.6%, the UK's. US productivity growth over that period was 2.2%, whereas ours, as I said, I mean, on that experimental series is around 0. So you've got quite a divergence in supply performance, which I think is relevant to monetary policy makers. It's certainly relevant to us. I think it's also relevant in the US context that while they're seeing stronger demand than we've got, they've also got stronger supply. So I tend to think of, we've both got in common tight labour markets, but theirs is a tight labour market with quite strong demand and what seems to be stronger supply, whereas our tight labour market is based on much more subdued growth in demand and very little growth in supply. And that does have consequences for monetary policy.
We're going to run out of time, so I'm just going to take, there's two, there was another one, was there?
Yeah.
All right, I think we'll just take this because this was the one that's long-standing.
You're all very, I should tell you, well, you probably can tell, but you all look very blue.
And we're feeling very bright.
We probably look very pink, but you look...
Thanks. Jeff Crocker from Basic Income Forum. You commented on the effect of high interest rates in dampening demand. Could you comment on their effect on the supply in the economy? of high interest rates. And given that you said that services are a big driver in inflation, do you anticipate that will attract investment in further automation of services to therefore address that element of inflation?
I mean, in the short term, obviously, setting a more restrictive monetary policy, it increases the cost of borrowing. It's likely to press down on investment. But what I would say is that in the long term, getting inflation back to target, and this is a point I tried to say at the end, that really is the best thing that we can do in terms of future-proofing the UK economy. We're not going to have, as a monetary policy setting body, we shouldn't have any impact on longer-term supply in terms of a negative impact. But what we can do by getting inflation back to target, the certainty of doing that, we can provide the necessary conditions for higher potential growth. But the drivers of higher potential growth that I was just talking about in the answer to the previous question, those really come from measures that are outside of our remit. They come from government. Your other question was?
Given that services are 40% of inflation, will that attract automation in the service sector?
Well, it depends if it's sustained. I mean, but over time, what is striking, I think, is how labour-intensive some parts of UK services are. But it's hard to generalise because, it's a very heterogeneous sector. I think what I would say more generally, and it comes back to what I was saying about potential growth, is that you would, in order to see higher potential growth, you do want more investment in more productive technologies, and you want the innovation to support those productive technologies. But I'll leave it at that.
Right, we're gonna move on. I'm gonna let you get back to your Lemsip, and thank you very much for coming through. And I'm gonna hand over the reins to Mark Cliffe from the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks. My name is Mark Cliffe. I have the honour of moderating this first panel on a very important topic of climate change. I would just like to invite my fellow panellists to the stage. We have Danae and Dieter to join me here. And while they're joining me on stage, I'll just introduce myself. I suppose to the theme of the conference, I've accidentally been future-proofing myself by becoming a part-time academic. I'm a visiting fellow, as you've heard, at the Global Systems Institute at Exeter University. I'm an associate business fellow at the UK Centre for Greening, Finance and Investment. And I'm a visiting professor at the London Institute of Banking and Finance, and occasionally I do a bit of consulting on the side. And my wife was saying, well, why don't you retire? Well, I'm not interested. I want to future-proof my career. Most of my career actually has been as chief economist of a number of banks, most recently ING. And as a result, I've developed, I think, a healthy skepticism about economic forecasting. We saw some of the forecast errors that Dave presented in the previous session, and it didn't get any movie rights, but I did write a blog called Confessions of an Economic Forecaster a few years ago. I mean, I would have loved to have seen the movie on that. So Google that. You can entertain yourself with some of my career lessons on economic forecasting. But the fact is, we do live in a world that's marked by disruptive and unprecedented change, if you like, a shocking world. I mean, you heard a lot, again, we heard quite a lot of shock language from Dave earlier on. So, and this is in a number of realms, which I think economists would do well to spend more time thinking about, which is politics, society, technology, and last and by no means least, environment. Now, since leaving ING, I've been grappling with how to address these radical uncertainties. And I've found that scenarios are a good way to go. They're not perfect, but I think this is a technique that deserves more attention. And I've been spending most of my time on the most pressing change that we're facing at the moment, which is to the climate. And I've been developing what I call decision-useful climate scenarios. It sounds a rather pejorative term compared to the existing field, but I think if you read some of the reports that we've been publishing, you'll see why. The most recent is called No Time to Lose, on which I was the lead author. So if you Google No Time to Lose Exeter, you'll find it immediately. Now, in the light of this, I'm delighted to have been given this opportunity by George and Stephanie to moderate this panel. We are going to be looking at the implications of climate change for the economy and macroeconomic policy. And we're honoured today to have as our main speaker Sir Dieter Helm. He's a professor of economic policy at the University of Oxford and a fellow of economics at New College. From 2012 to 2020, he was the independent chair of the Natural Capital Committee, providing advice to the government on the sustainable use of natural capital. And he's just published another book entitled Legacy: How to Build a Sustainable Economy, highly relevant to this panel, of course. And he addresses the question, what would the sustainable economy look like, and what would it take to live within our environmental means? And in the spirit of public goods, this is available on open access. You can download this freely. No doubt he'll tell us the backstory to that one. And before I hand over to Dieter, I would like to introduce Danae Kyriakopoulou, who will follow. She is the co-head of the Bank of England's Climate Hub. The Hub supports the bank with strategy and capabilities to help it play a leading role in understanding ensuring the financial system and the bank itself are resilient to the risks from climate change and in understanding its macroeconomic implications. Prior to joining the Bank of England, she was a distinguished policy fellow at the LSE, and Danae is also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Well, since we have no time to lose, and by the way, do we have an extra 10 minutes, given that we started 10 minutes late? An extra 5, okay, so we'll finish at 2:40, so we're on notice. Okay, good. So, yes, the stage is yours, Dieter. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words today. The topic of this conference, future-proofing the world economy. I intend to address that head-on in 3 ways. First, briefly asking the question, is it future-proofed? Which the answer is going to be no. The second bit is, what would we have to do to make it future-proofed? By which I mean, what would we have to do to live in the sustainable economy? Which I think you'll find very challenging. And thirdly, what happens if we don't? Which is very likely. So on that happy note, let me start off with reminding you, just quickly, how unsustainable our economy is. So we hear a lot about doubling the number of wind turbines, increasing the number of solar panels, getting some electric vehicles, and fitting a few heat pumps. What we don't hear much about is what contribution that's actually making to addressing climate change. Since 1990, we have added 2 parts per million per annum to the carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And it's that stock of carbon which is the causal factor in climate change. I'll come on to a moment that that's the product of 2 things. Emissions, yes, of course, but sequestration or damage to sequestration is the other part of the equation. So not only have we made no progress at all in denting the increase in parts per million in carbon in the atmosphere. Nobody in their right minds in 1990 would think that diagram is a success for climate change policy. and the 27 COPs we've had so far. But it's also the case we haven't dented the use of fossil fuels either. The world is 80% dependent on fossil fuels. Hasn't changed very much at all. And of the rest, you might think, oh, well, the rest is all wind farms and solar panels. No, 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 no. The rest is mostly nuclear and hydro. And if you want to look at some of the impacts of the hydro, have a look at the destruction of the Mekong currently taking place, building hydro all the way down it. The renewables are a small bit on the top. And it's very easy to double a small bit. But what you have to do is make a difference to 80% fossil fuel dependency, and you have to do it quickly. Right? And so far, not much progress. And you might think, oh, well, the UK is doing much better. And in one respect, it is. We've got out of coal. That is a fantastic achievement. Okay? But abstract from that, we're well over 70% fossil fuel dependent in this economy, and that's pretty resilient too. So anyone who thinks that we're on the path to cracking climate change, having been at the job for 33 years, is delusional. The scale of the challenge ahead of us is truly enormous, and anyone who believes another 27 COPs are going to get us there, well, good luck. I probably won't live long enough to see 27 more COPs, but I put my money on that not being the route to getting a serious addressing of that 80% fossil fuels. We're over 100 million barrels a day of oil now, 104, I think, 102, and that's likely to go up, not down. But the IEA says that it must come down to at least to a maximum of 77 by 2030 if we're to hit 1.5. Good luck with that. I'll bet anyone that we will not be on 77 million barrels a day in 2030. Now, I don't say any of that with anything other than factual observation. That's what the facts are. 80% dependent on fossil fuels, 2 parts per million every single year. You can't see the financial crisis on there. And indeed, it's not clear that even the COVID lockdowns made any difference. And the reason for that is that there's a second part of this story, which is it's not just getting emissions down, it's looking after the sequestration side of the world. The world's natural systems, emissions, sequestration, plankton, rainforests, coastal marshes, etc. And if you look what we've been doing, and this is the important point when you look at the lack of impact of even the draconian lockdowns that we had for COVID, is that we've been quite simply damaging the ability of the world to sequestrate carbon at the same time as we've been increasing the emissions. Indeed, if you want some frightening considerations, there are now bits of the Amazon which are net emitters of carbon. And just in case you get very carried away with the excitement of EVs, I bought one, it's great virtue signaling, okay? Do have a look at the supply chain that lies behind it. I have done so now. The solar panels I've got, 80% from China, many from the Uyghur area. Well, you'll know there's 1 million people in camps, and there is even forcible sterilization of women taking place. I'm feeling pretty worried about that, and it's incredibly intensive using coal energy to make those solar panels. But then look to the minerals, the cobalt, the lithium, the nickel, the copper. Have a look and Google Earth. See if you can see the cobalt mines in the Congo. I'm told, I've not done it, but I'm told you can probably see the child labour from space. But you look at the devastation, that's just nickel mining in Indonesia. Rainforest cleaned to do the nickel mining and then the refining before it gets here. The scale of mining to come and the environmental impact of creating the minerals for the low carbon technologies. We can't just think it's a nice windmill or it's a nice little solar panel and think, oh, that's net zero emissions, that's all fine. You have to look at the complete supply chain behind it, and that's enormously challenging. And then you have to measure emissions properly. So soil has roughly 4 times the carbon of the atmosphere. Think what's coming in agriculture, Agriculture is about 25% of world emissions. It's less so in the UK, but it's making very little contribution to decarbonisation. It's just to get a scale on what you actually have to do if you really genuinely want to stop climate change. It's not enough to peak emissions in China. If emissions peak in China and it carries on emitting at that peak level, we're in difficulty. China's emitted as much carbon in the last 8 years as the United Kingdom has done since 1750 and the Industrial Revolution. These are facts. They're not distorted observations. And so anyone who thinks we're on a sustainable path, I haven't said very much about what we've been doing to biodiversity. Most of the biodiversity is beneath our feet and what we've been doing to that. But if you add these things together, nobody in their right mind can think that we're on a future-proof path or that we're on, in my terms, a sustainable path. So the question that I've been addressing, and the question in my book, is what would the sustainable economy look like? Not how to get there, just what would it look like for us to actually live in an economy that's sustainable? And I have 3 bits to this which are very challenging to conventional economic ways of thought. The economic tools, as I put it in my book, break in your hands when you come to think about the structure of this economy. The first bit is that I base it upon citizens who are also consumers, but not just consumers. I'll come on in a moment, but what we're trying to do is pass on our economy to the next generation in a decent state, and that next generation is comprised of citizens, some of which will be immensely rich, and some of them won't, but they'll all need access to the building blocks I'll come to in a moment. And I'm not interested in making people happy. I'm interested in whether people have the wherewithal to choose how to live their lives. And that's going to be about assets. Also, not interested in expected utility and forecasting the future. Do any of you really have any idea what the world will look like in 2050? When I did my doctoral thesis under Amartya Sen, I did it with a portable Olympus typewriter and Tipex and carbon paper. The iPhone was completely inconceivable to me. The internet, word processing, that's all happened in my working lifetime. And the speed of technical change isn't slowing down. We have not much capability to forecast the economy 6 months ahead, as was just demonstrated. Anyone who thinks that you're going to get some statistical model and forecast out what the world economy looks like in 2050 and then work on the basis of that, well, good luck to you on that too. What we want to do is assume that we are radically uncertain about that future and make sure that future is resilient. And there are some things that we can have a degree of certainty about which will be needed in that future world. Not necessarily exactly how they're going to be provided, but we will know what the core infrastructure assets should look like. The natural capital of our world will be needed. It's pretty hard to imagine any world without a good dose of natural capital. We will need a decent climate, and we will need an energy, water, transport, and fibre network, or set of networks. And these are all systems. They're not discrete little bits like cost-benefit analysis in the economics textbook. These are systems, energy systems, ecosystems, water catchment systems, and so on. So these building blocks, citizens, resilience in the face of radical uncertainty, and assets, not flows, are the focus. And what we want to do is to leave the next generation with a set of assets so that they can choose how to live their lives. And I re-echo the point, this isn't about making people happy. I didn't try with my children, although I was probably very unsuccessful anyway, and I'm sure they're not with my grandchildren, try to make them happy. I did try, I don't want them to be unhappy, but I tried, like most parents will try, to make sure they were set up so that they could choose how to live their lives. they had a decent education, they had a whole series of assets, human capital assets, etc., within which to function. This is what is part of the capabilities to choose how to live your life. This is Amartya Sen. This is not utilitarianism and all the baggage that goes with utilitarian calculation. So they'll need these core assets. If they don't have a decent education, if there isn't a health system, if there isn't an energy system, if there isn't a water system, if there's a sewage system, if there isn't a natural environment, if there isn't a decent climate, they will not have the capacity to choose how to live their lives in the way we can. And what that means is that these core assets, these infrastructures, need to be maintained and passed on in good heart to the next generation. And that means something quite radical and very different from what we're doing now. It means we have to do capital maintenance and not borrow for capital maintenance. We have to fix the roof on the tiles so the house is still there into the future out of current income, as we used to do. You don't want to value these assets. You don't have a price of nature because you're not going to do anything other than perpetuate these assets as assets in perpetuity. Right? And I come on to the implication of this for depreciation, but it's very strong. And of course, in doing that capital maintenance, to maintain those infrastructures in place for the next generation to choose how to live their lives, we have to build in some safety margin. And we sure need that, given how much damage we've now been doing and how far we've moved down the climate change curve and the biodestruction curve. So in order to pass on those assets to the next generation, we need to, in our generation, live within our sustainable means. And if we were to live in our sustainable means, such that these assets pass down the generations and the next generation can choose how to live their lives, we would have to do three things which would become extremely painful to the current voters and consumers. The first is we'd have to pay for capital maintenance. Right? And you might think, well, that's just capital maintenance. When we went into the 1980s and we started the game of privatization, about which I'm completely neutral, what we did was we moved from a world from 1945 to the end of the 70s in which we did pay-as-you-go for our infrastructures to a world of pay when delivered. And we know why this was the case. Politicians representing us, the electorates, wanted us to benefit from further investment and development of these infrastructure assets, but they didn't want us to pay. They didn't want the price to go up. Hold the prices down, but, get the stuff done. Way to do that, borrow and let the future people pay for it. All the power stations built from 1945 to the end of the 70s were built out of current income. It was 3% GDP growth per year and 7% growth in electricity demand per annum for 30 years. All those nuclear power stations, Drax, all that lot was paid for out of current income, and the bill payers paid that. Right? Now, none of it is. Indeed, much worse, most capital maintenance is treated as investment and borrowed for to do that investment. That's how national income accounts actually account for investment in respect of capital maintenance. We've shifted the liability. Effectively what we said is, you know what? You want the potholes filled. You want us to maintain the roads. I tell you what, we'll borrow from you. We'll fix the potholes and you can pay for the maintenance to get the assets in the same state as we inherited them. Not, we're going to enhance the assets. You're going to pay for just fixing the potholes in the road. And the potholes in the road is a great analogy for all the other capital maintenance things. We're going to borrow to fix the school roofs because we didn't maintain the roofs from the water getting into the rack concrete. It's all going to be borrowing for investment when it isn't investment, it's capital maintenance. And we should be doing the capital maintenance out of current income for the ecosystems, the atmosphere, the physical infrastructures, all of them, the social capital and the human capital, as we used to do. It's not as if we haven't done this before. Post-1980 is when we stopped doing this. We also have to pay for the pollution we cause. An efficient economy is an economy in which all costs are internalised. So if I raise in general equilibrium, perfect competition, with all the costs included. Nearly all the pollution costs are not included. Right? So therefore, we are in a very inefficient economy. We are not paying for the damage we're causing through pollution. We're leaving that for someone else to clean up later. It means proper carbon taxes. It means proper pesticide taxes. It means proper taxation of environmental damage. And when it comes to carbon tax, of course, it's not about territorial carbon production. It's about carbon consumption. It's about your carbon footprint. As in the brief period when I was, it's 2 weeks actually, I was Boris Johnson's personal energy advisor. Very interesting experience. I'm not sure when it started, but I'm very unsure when it ended. But anyway, I did say, you know, if you really want to do well on your carbon performance targets and boast even further to the world how well we're doing, then it's pretty simple. I can do it in a week for you. I can get the numbers much better. How can this be done? Excitement was very obvious. The answer is just close the steel industry, close Ineos Grangemouth plant, hope Brexit finishes off the car industry. Right? It's got an amusing side, but it's got a deadly serious one. If you switch from an industrial economy in the 1970s with an energy-intensive base, and you move to an 80% service economy, what do you think's going to happen? Do you think climate change is going to be any better as a result if you import the stuff from China instead of produce it here? Where the carbon's emitted makes no difference to climate change. So it's your carbon footprint that causes climate change. And contrary to what the Climate Change Committee claimed, that when we get to net zero, we'll no longer be causing climate change, absolutely not true, unless everybody in the world is also at net zero at the same time on an emissions basis. So it's carbon consumption, and that's a hell of a lot higher than carbon production. It's worse than that, actually, because the territorial carbon emissions don't include Drax Power Station. Can you imagine? Right? That's not included because it's wood pellets and the trees grow in America. And what about the emissions from soils, peats, and the coastal marine areas? What about the sequestration side? You have to be honest about this if you want to do this. And then there's the savings problem. If you want to do a massive amount of investment, and this is a huge investment, as well as a big capital maintenance, you might think that the way to do this is to have the savings to equal investment. Now, I know Keynesians have investment causes savings, and classicists have savings causing investment. But the fact is that the great economic transformations around the world in the 20th century have all been made on the basis of high savings ratios. Look at the British economy. Government is a net dissaver. Retained earnings, there really aren't many in the whole of British industries. Profits equal dividends. And because of our balance of payments position and the borrowings that go behind this, much of British industry is now foreign owned. We sell the family silver to pay to live beyond our means on the current account. And as individuals, savings are pathetically low. What we want to do is do all this transformation in the UK, all this great net zero stuff, etc., on the kindness of strangers. Now, when people talk about the investment in the North Sea, it's almost all foreign. Nothing wrong with that per se. But you then have to think about where the frame is. If you're not prepared to lower your consumption to make room for investment, you expect other people to lower their consumption to raise their savings to meet the pitch. And that isn't sustainable either. So, what would this mean in macro terms? Well, if I were doing the autumn statement on Wednesday, which I had no ambition ever to do anything like that, but what a horrendous task to do, I would start by producing the government's accounts on a sustainable basis. I'd have a current account and I'd have a capital account. Call it the P&L and the balance sheet. Okay? It would be a doomsday book. It would sum up our assets and report those, and it would report how much spending from tax revenue we could do net of capital maintenance. Okay? So when people talk about the odd 10 billion available to, I don't know, abolish inheritance tax or whatever the latest idea is to lower taxation, that's a delusion about what the fiscal position actually is, because it's the fiscal position before doing the capital maintenance. Right? And you can argue about whether they're private rather than public, but it's all part of the national balance sheet that you put together in the way you put a doomsday book. And of course, on the bottom line, the only thing you'd borrow for is for new enhancement investment, not capital maintenance. Interesting example of that, we're going to spend quite a lot, apparently, of the money saved from the investment that was going to go into HS2 into the capital maintenance of fixing the potholes in the road. But that's called investment. It's not. Okay? Now, if you were to recalculate the accounts on that basis, you would arrive at a different position. And the summary of that is to ask, what is the sustainable consumption path of the economy? So, in my calculation, it is, after you've made these allowances. So, if you look at the frame of where we are now and you think of consumption doing this, there would be a significant fall to the sustainable path. That's why it's politically impossible. Right? I'll come to that point in a moment. Okay? Because what I'm suggesting is the consumption's too high, whereas most macroeconomists sit poring over the FT to see the latest retail sales figures, and if consumption is going down and not up, that's a bad thing. Okay? Whereas what I'm interested in is lowering the consumption level, increasing the investment bit, of course, in this frame, so not necessarily affecting, not that I care much about it, but aggregate demand and the things that Keynesians get terribly excited about. But there would be a lowering of the path. But here's where I depart from radical environmentalists. Environmentalists not only say we should lower our consumption, but they say we should also have no economic growth. Utter nonsense. Economic growth is driven by technical change. Look around you. See how fast technical change is taking place. Think about AI. Think about the digitalization of the economy. Think about genetics. Think about going to the doctor and seeing your entire genome put up on the screen for you to look at. It's incredible what's happening around us. I have benefited from the fact that in my pocket is a computer which is more powerful than Oxford University's computer was when I was doing my doctorate on my typewriter. That's progress, human progress, opening up human possibilities. So it's not that we shouldn't be carrying on the path upwards. It's we should adjust to the proper trend line, and then to the extent there's economic growth, there's no reason why humans should not get better off through time, through all the possibilities that technology puts our way. And as I say, if I say this in an environmental context, people regard it as terribly controversial. It's not GDP growth. GDP doesn't measure anything particularly interesting when you're looking at the sustainable economy. But it is a growth in the prospects of humans, and therefore the ability of future humans to choose how to live their lives enabled with better technologies than ourselves. And that brings me to my last slide, which is what I'm currently writing about, which is called How It Ends. Now, just to cut to that, I don't think it ends in an unmitigated end of human civilization, us getting rendered extinct, and all the horror stories that people tell us about the end days. And most religions tell us about those too, actually. Most religions have the end days somewhere in there. But it is important to ask the question, if you believe, if you buy what I said at the beginning that we're not on a sustainable path, and you also think that it's politically impossible to sell to the public that they should adjust themselves to a sustainable consumption path and move back to a world where they're paying for capital maintenance of the natural environment and the core infrastructures. If you believe that that isn't politically possible, as people say, no one's ever going to do this, are they? Right? Then you have to look at the conclusion. If it is not sustainable, it will not be sustained. You can't not do what you need to get onto the sustainable path and hope that the world in the future is going to be all bright and shiny and all sustainable, because it isn't. Because the temperature will be significantly higher. there will be a lot less species on this planet. Ecosystems, rainforests, etc., will be seriously damaged. The Amazon may cease to be a functioning rainforest in not my lifetime, but your lifetime. These things will happen as a consequence. And what that tells you is that if you're not doing enough capital maintenance, if you're borrowing for capital maintenance instead of for the capital maintenance you do, rather than taking out of current consumption, if you're not paying for the pollution you're caused, you are going to be forced onto the sustainable path, but it's going to be a much lower path than it otherwise would have been. And that's a simple way of putting what lots of people observe, which is the costs of going to the sustainable path are less than the costs of not doing so and facing the consequences. But the sad fact is that the consequences are meted out on the next generation, not much on us, and particularly not much in a temperate world as is Western Europe. And that's where one ends up at the frame. Now, there are lots of practical things you can do which edge towards these particular outcomes. There are things you can do with the energy sector, things you can do with these systems, a whole range of possibilities, provided you use the tools of systems, assets, and capital maintenance, and therefore effectively current cost accounting. Lots of stuff to do, but there remains the question, are we likely to do enough? And my conclusion, which is not pessimistic or optimistic, but I think is driven by the analysis, is we aren't going to do enough, not yet, and therefore we will have to work out how we're going to live with the consequences. Thank you very much.
So,
thank you.
over to Danae. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dieter.
Thank you. It's great to be here and also to have this session so early on in the program. I think when it comes to climate change, it's not so much about future-proofing, it's present-proofing. It's something that is already affecting our economies and our financial systems in a very profound way. Dieter's first slide really showed how we are on the wrong track when it comes to emissions, sequestration, also a very important point. And we look at the headlines over the past year. In 2023, we've had, and 2022, we've had incredible levels of natural disasters, climate change intensifying in frequency and geographic spread is no longer something that's happening in some remote parts of the world, affecting limited parts of the global economy. We've seen recently the floods in Pakistan, the Texas freezing in the developed world, also in the UK heat waves. So it's something that's really very much for the present. And it's not just religious stories about the world ending. This is very much scientific warnings in terms of what will happen if climate is not acted upon, climate inaction being profoundly dangerous, and that the current policies are on track to get us there, unfortunately, even though we have committed to limiting global warming to close to below 2 degrees and close to 1.5. 3 degrees, science is very unanimous on kind of how close that would be to civilization, ending type of temperatures not seen in over 3 million years. So we have very, very clear warnings from the science and how action needs to start now. We also have clear direction from policy with the signing of the Paris Agreement and more recently also on the biodiversity side as well. So this is something that we as central banks take as a given. It's not up to us to make climate policy, to make these decisions, but it's very clear that both these physical impacts from climate change and the transition that will be required to address it and the commitments that will have to be made. And there's many options to get there. I think we've heard a lot in the previous presentation on the options to do that, will have impacts on the macroeconomy and on the financial system. So it's a question of understanding how do we forecast the economy, how do we understand the economy differently. The models that we have from the 1990s and before are not fit for purpose in that respect. And we in central banks have come together to create the network of greening the financial system. The Bank of England was one of the founding members of that back in December 2017 to look at how does climate change affect the financial system, but also how can we understand the macroeconomy differently. The models that we've been using in central banks do not take climate change as a kind of factor on its own so far, and this is something that we're working on. And also, how can we, in my role as supervisors of the financial system, work with the financial institutions we supervise to understand how they prepare in terms of managing these types of systems. And it's a story of not just protecting from risk, but also a story of investment and a story of growth. I think we agree very much on that with Dieter in terms of how he presented his frame of thinking, that we need significant levels of investment to get us there. And it's not a question of sacrificing growth. It is, in fact, a growth story when you look at the number of jobs that are created in these industries, in terms of the productivity improvements that we're seeing, in terms of, for example, lowering levels of air pollution, in addition to solving for the existential threat of climate change, all these so-called economic co-benefits of climate action. Even if you weren't solving for an existential threat, there are improvements to the economy in terms of having more productive cities, in terms of having lower levels of air pollution, in terms of having higher energy security and energy resilience, something that has been very evident with the crisis of energy prices following the Russia invasion of Ukraine. So in terms of the financial sector and the investment that's required, the change obviously needs to happen in the real economy. Technological growth and innovation is something that economists, I think, we're notoriously bad at capturing. I think the iPhone example or smartphone example that Dieter gave is a classic one in terms of how we could not have predicted some years ago of where that would be. And you are seeing this also in terms of the innovation of low carbon technologies and low carbon innovation. The cost of many of these technologies has come down rapidly. This has come at the expense of critical minerals, mining, supply chain, and this is something that, of course, also cannot be underestimated. But at the same time, we are not going to get there without investment. This is not an excuse of staying with the dirty technologies of the past. And investment is not going to happen by itself. We need the right policies for it. And when it comes to investment, it's about both a move and a shift from investing in the bad to investing in the good, investing in the high carbon intensive sectors to shifting to investing to low carbon intensive sectors, but also a scale up in investment in terms of looking at the numbers of what is going to be required to get to 1.5 degrees. It's a significant step up in investments. And so that is a question of kind of the how do we get to addressing this urgent policy and a question of climate change, but also a question of how quickly can we do it. And for that, we need a very supportive financial architecture behind it. We need transparency, we need information. It's not just the externality and the market failure of pollution and of emissions. There are a lot of other market failures involved in terms of the public goods of some of these technologies and some of these innovations. There are market failures in terms of the information asymmetries that exist, and how do we solve these through data, through standards, through taxonomies that the financial system can use to have a better understanding of what to invest in and how to also compare across institutions that may have the same carbon intensity today and the same carbon footprint today, but may have a very different plan, some more credible, some less credible in terms of how they're addressing that. And so the financial system is developing what we are calling transition plans in terms of being able to assess and address how credible these plans of whether it's in the financial institutions or whether it's in the real economy to transition to net zero. Finally, also some words on nature and biodiversity. I think we should not underestimate that. This is something that for us as central banks is something more new. In the NGFS, this network that I've mentioned, we now have a task force on nature where we are trying to understand the impacts not just of climate change on the macroeconomy, but also of nature and of these processes that I think were in one of Dieter's slides as well, in terms of how do we understand the dependency of different financial systems on ecosystem services, what happens if some acute type of risks to nature, like a pandemic, or some of the more chronic risks, like pollinators and effects on agriculture sectors, for example. But also, how can we address that? What are the kind of financial innovations that we can see in terms of investing in nature? It's not as straightforward as some of the more infrastructure type of investments we heard before about the kind of paying now or paying later, or still there is some form of return in those types of assets, whereas there are other types of investments related to addressing climate change and nature risk, where it's not a straightforward return, it's more a kind of avoiding of future costs, avoiding of future damages, and how can you financially engineer that so that there are incentives to invest in it today. And finally, there are some types of investment which are not avoided losses in the future and are not making returns today, but which we still have to do to have this kind of political possibility that you also spoke about, questions about how do we bring people along, questions around the just transition, questions around loss and damage to countries that are being hit the hardest from the physical effects of climate change. This was a very big breakthrough in last year's COP that will be up for the test in this year's COP. It is not a perfect structure in terms of global governance, but it's the only one we have at the moment, so we have to work with that. And yeah, I'll close there and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Danae. I think we have about sort of 5 minutes or so left. Is that right? Yeah. So
10.
Okay. Well, we'll see how we go. We may have the plug pulled from us. So before I hand over to the audience, I'd just perhaps slip in a question to Dieter. It strikes me, you've made a very plausible case for your sustainable path. But what about the practicality and the politics of this? I mean, how likely do you think it is that politicians will embrace these ideas and will actually move in this direction?
Well, I've never thought that policy adjusts before a crisis, and worked on energy policy for a long time, and it's always after a crisis you get an adjustment, not before. And the fact is the crisis to everyday voters isn't that great. But there's one really, I think, dangerous thing that's going on in the politics of this, which is politicians have rushed out to tell us it's all free. We're told repeatedly that net zero is going to lower energy costs, and we should switch immediately to low carbon routes. Well, if it's true, I suggest that those who believe this should get outside Parliament with a placard saying, "End subsidies now," because they're not necessary. It'd be like the 5 watt. It's not true that it's free. The costs of having an intermittent energy system which renders even nuclear power stations intermittent, of building an entirely new grid, of building a new car charging system, of rebuilding what are, in my view, not in good shape distribution networks. These, by the way, have been using depreciation, historic cost depreciation of the assets, which is capital consumption. If you look at the accounting, this is why this capital maintenance current cost accounting really matters. They've been consuming capital. So it's not just profits equal dividends. It's dividends are partly from capital consumption. So my answer is, at least be honest. Stop telling us that renewables are 10 times cheaper than gas, or 3 times cheaper, or your bills are going to go down. No, they're going to go up. And what's happened is the public here, in Germany, in France and elsewhere have discovered that what they've been told is not true, and the consequence is that whereas many people say, of course, yeah, I'm in favour of doing something with climate change, it doesn't cost me anything, right? Now that changes. How much will you be prepared? £1 a week? £1 a year to contribute? So I would like some honesty in the discussion, and I think that helps the politics shape forward. And the next time you hear a politician telling you it's all going to lower your energy bills, in this case, ask for the evidence, and then ask for why they think subsidies should still be paid. I think we should pay a lot of subsidies, but then I think this is going to be a very expensive transition from where we are to where we need to get to.
It's interesting you say this, because it's not just politicians who are making this argument. Academics are also arguing that technology is getting cheaper. I mean, you cited the example of the iPhone and so on, and we've seen...
Yeah. So of course costs are getting cheaper. And by the way, technical progress in fossil fuels is fantastically fast. Anyone who watched that drilling to intercept the explosion on Deepwater Horizon at 5,000 meters deep horizontally to intercept. The technology on that side is going, and shale is very fast too. So yes, technical progress, but don't assume that it's always going to do this. So the government announced this week that the floor price for the next auction round for North Sea wind is going to be, what, 70% higher, right, than currently. I don't know if that's great, it's 50 or 70, some number like that. It's a huge increase because that supply chain is not a marginal supply chain anymore. It's really substantive. So the technical progress you want to worry about is what's happening in mining. Is mining getting much better? Is the refining technologies having cost falls? Not just is the manufacture of a solar panel by a country trying to dump solar panels on the world economy falling, right? You mustn't just assume the world is all wonderful if it's renewables and all going to be cost raising if it's fossil fuels. Not a bit of it. Right? They all have cost changes, but they're all different, and wind in particular is a very mature technology.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think when we talk about subsidies, it's not just talking about the green subsidies and the subsidies for renewables, but also wider subsidy reform. What we're dealing with here is market failures, and the IMF has estimated we're still subsidizing fossil fuels, whether through implicit or explicit subsidies, to a total of $7 trillion at a 7% of global GDP around there.
Could I just reply on that? The marginal cost of oil is about $10. The actual price is 70-something today. We pay an enormous tax to OPEC for the difference between the marginal cost of oil and the actual cost. And if you look at the comparisons for the calculations about what the impact of slowing down the point where petrol and diesel cars go out, I mean, I'm not in favour of slowing down, but that point, there's a lot of tax in petrol. So I just don't believe for a moment, that this calculation that's always quoted from the IMF is correct. I think actually we really heavily tax, when you include the monopoly tax, oil. Not coal, not gas, but oil.
Okay, so...
And maybe just on the comparison with kind of the two courses of action, it's still comparing the cost of the transition to a world where we can still grow with unaddressed climate change is also very dangerous. So it's kind of comparing that to inaction, which would be even more costly.
We have a question over here.
Thank you, Mark Falcon, regulatory economist. Dieter, you've always argued, of course, for carbon consumption taxes, but climate physicists say that you can achieve the same thing by mandating geological net zero. So every drop of oil you take out of the ground, you have to put it back into the geosphere. And as you said, oil producers have got the money to pay for that. So would you support that as a policy?
Well, some oil producers got the money to pay for that, but not necessarily the oil companies who buy the stuff from them. Okay? So Saudi Aramco, which by the way has an annual dividend which is greater than the entirety of the promised climate fund at the COPs, just as an aside, okay, might be in a position. But if you set a physical limit, right, so you say this is the carbon budget for the world, right, then you say if you produce, you have to offset that, rocks to rocks, etc., that's a carbon price. And I'd do it via a price rather than try to do it through regulation, because government failure is typically very big. And remember, all the Climate Change Committee's calculations and the Stern Report calculations, as far as I understand them, are on the assumption of perfect government policy. Have a look at smart meters, just as an example, before one comes up with these low estimates of the total cost. But, you know, a price... There's a reason why economists like prices, because they are, to a degree, immune from lobbying for particular technologies and particular outcomes. Right? We're going down the other route, and therefore the costs of government failure have to be factored into the total costs of the programme.
I'm going to sneak in just one more question. I think there's a person at the back there who's had his hand up some time.
Who do you think holds responsibility?
Could you just say your name and institution, please?
Oh, it's Callum Blocker, Nottingham Trent University. Who do you think holds responsibility for making this change to a sustainable path? When the supply chain contributes the vast majority of global emissions, how can we hold people accountable, and how can we make a change towards sustainability? And if consumers are part of the problem, Does greenwashing in the form of corporate lobbying, for example, create a barrier to swaying consumer opinion that means it may be impossible for us to change to a sustainable path?
Okay, so the short answer to your question is that the polluters are you and me. It's us, the citizens, who do the polluting. You know, oil companies don't produce oil for the fun of it. They produce it because you and I buy it, right? And it's, in the end, we like this idea, and you know, organisations like Just Stop Oil like these ideas, that it's all the fault of these nasty companies. And if only we can, by gluing ourselves to the door or whatever it is, stop these people producing, it's going to be fine, as if it's not our fault. Right? I'm always amazed at the number of people I meet who want to do something about climate change, but then go flying. I don't fly. Right? That's a tiny bit in my general hypocrisy in these particular worlds. But ultimately, it comes down to us. Now, it's true that there's lobbying. There always has been. And there always is an interest in producers in persuading us to consume the outcome. But without the agency of ourselves, and therefore ultimately politics, being able to vote to make these things happen, we're not going to have the impact we needed. And for example, we should vote for a high carbon tax. We should vote that we all pay for the carbon pollution. That would make a great deal of difference to your and my carbon diary. In my net zero book, I suggest we all write a carbon diary down, and then imagine what it would be like to write that carbon diary down in 250 without emissions. And I make my students write down and post to themselves, obviously electronically now, in 250, what they predicted they would do in order to get from here to there. Okay? But I think there's a great temptation to say, not our fault, we're not going to pay the costs of pollution, must be some nasty companies out there, and until they change their ways, we're fine. Actually, we have to take some agency. And indeed, in the developed world, more agency than in the developing world, because our consumption levels are higher. It's us doing the unsustainable consumption.
Well, sadly, we have no time to lose for the tea break. So thank you once again to Dieter and to Danae for their presentation. Thank you.
If you could just be back by 3, I think. So we'll just push it at 5 minutes. Thanks.